when Shane asked me to speak on this. I said I spoke on this before, and I don't normally speak on these topics more than once or twice, but I've just given this one in the States. And I suspect that one of the reasons I was asked to talk about this is there are some interesting court cases and their implications for arborists, particularly municipal arborists, about to take place in the state of Victoria. So it probably doesn't hurt to get a bit of a refresher and some of the information on this. And as Shane did say, I've just stepped back into Australia. I hope I'm not too jet lagged. I arrived a couple of days ago and I did wake up incredibly early this morning, I must admit. Now what I'm going to talk about is wind throw, and towards the end of this presentation I hope I'm going to get very practical so that for folks that are out there assessing trees, for councils that have risk and hazard policies, some of this makes sense. And the reason I wrote this paper was that back, I think it was in about 2012, I was overseas and I happened to be watching CNN and its broadcast of the effects of Superstorm Sandy, they called it at the time, on New York. And they had a clip of a tree which they ran over and over and over again. You know, that's the way the media seems to work. I saw this tree fall over 65,000 times in about 3 days. And it was a classic piece of wind throw. You know, the tree was standing there, the guy had his little camera out the window, the storm blows, and the tree sort of completely topples over. And of course, the media over there was just full of all these trees that had been damaging. And of course, what I found interesting was nobody talked about all the trees that didn't fall over. They talked about the ones that do. Now you've got to remember, in education we're very familiar with this bias. When you do a plant health subject, for example as a student, the implication of your doing that subject is you sort of think every tree is diseased and is going to die, because you only talk about the ones that are infected by something. The 99% that haven't got anything wrong with them, you think, well, you just don't take them into account. So what struck me was that you had all these trees that are really resilient and they didn't fall over. And so the question that I raised was, well, why does a particular tree fall over? Why does one tree fall over and others don't? And in this talk I'm going to be very specific about what I mean by wind throw. I'm talking about wind throw at ground level. I thought, by the way, that wind throw was the term that everybody used. They don't use it in the States, I've since discovered. But it's the term that I've always used, probably because it's the term that foresters used. And in my training way back in the 70s, I picked up that sort of jargon from the forestry side of things, and I've kept it ever since. And it involves the failure of the tree, the uprooting of the tree at the interface of the trunk with the soil, which involves the lifting of the roots, the snapping of roots, and sometimes the failure of the trunk at the soil surface. So that's what I'm talking about in this talk. I'm not talking about branch failures or things that fall off from the canopy. And the sort of thing that you sort of know about, you see something like this, every one of you is familiar with it. It was fascinating in the States, the person that was talking before I did at this conference was talking about the people's attitude to urban trees after Superstorm Sandy. Whether people would be saying we don't want any trees anymore or we want trees. Hers was a very interesting paper. And of course, when you do those social sort of science papers, you don't have a lot of photos, do you? You can only show so many groups of people networking and talking. You can only show so many sheets of diagrams with arrows between various stakeholders before it gets really boring. So she had all these slides up of trees that fell over. Okay? Lots and lots of them, absolute corkers. And virtually every one of them you could have put into my talk. So talk about having someone sort of prepare the ground for you. It was really wonderful. And you know what happens when a tree is often wind thrown. You have a relatively shallow root plate. You may or may not have descending roots. Very often the descending roots aren't there, and if they are, they're often sparse and they'll be pulled from the ground. So this is a sort of a typical wind-thrown tree. And this slide shows a tree from Faulkner Park. And what I want you to remember on this one is have a look about the base of that tree, and you can see where there's been fill placed. And you might say, how deep was the fill around the trunk of the tree? And the fill varies. On this particular specimen, it's about 30 centimetres of fill has been placed around the trunk of the tree. And so what you find on a lot of these trees is there's no trunk flaring, and you can't see any of the lateral roots in the root crown. And again, this was something that in a number of the illustrations that I saw, photographs of storm damage in the States, you couldn't see any of the trunk flaring, and you couldn't see any of the root crown. Now what happens usually in a windstorm event, a wind-thrown event, you can see here that the direction of wind is shown by the arrow. I've shown you a stable tree and the windward roots are intact. In a tree that is sort of wind-thrown, the windward roots are pulled from the soil and they break in tension and they snap in shear. In the healthy tree, the one that remains intact, the leadward roots remain intact, whilst in the fallen tree, the leadward roots buckle and hinge, and they normally buckle and hinge very close to the trunk of the tree. Sometimes, and some of you may have seen, where instead of being close to the trunk, the leadward roots break further out. Now what that tells you is that a greater force than usual has been applied. But more often than not, you're going to find that the hinge is very close to the trunk of the tree. And that diagram is reasonably accurate. Now when people ask why do trees get blown over, there are only two components to consider. There's the above ground part, the canopy and the branching system, which for a long time was regarded as being similar to the sail on a ship. And so the way trees used to be modelled was you had a mast, that is the trunk, and you had a sail, which is the foliage, and the engineering calculations were based on that sort of model. People knew that that wasn't really accurate, but let's face it, why would you bother being more accurate? You're only talking about trees, so who gave a damn? And if your calculations were out by 40 or 50%, well, what the heck? Okay, so that was basically the attitude. Now what it meant was, even the people that were using those models knew that the tree wasn't like a sail. It was more like a sail with a whole lot of holes in it that let the wind through. Okay, but to keep it simple, used the sail, and of course a lot of trees were removed because when they did the calculations they thought the forces on the tree were too great, and so the tree would be removed. And that went on for the best part of 50 or 60 years, and in a whole lot of councils they still use those models because, and I'm not just talking about in Australia, in lots of places you've got an engineering mentality that still sort of rules the roost in the council, and so why not use the commonly accepted engineering calculations, and that's what they do. And then of course you've got the root system that anchors the tree. Now very often, if you're asked to have a look at a tree in terms of its potential for wind throw, what people will do is they'll do an inspection of the above ground part of the tree. They'll look above and they'll expect to see how big is the tree, what's the foliage like, is there any dieback, is there lots of dead wood? And they're sort of looking for those characteristics. But that's only looking at half of the problem. You must assess the root system. The legal implications of this are quite significant, and I'm going to talk about that before I finish. So what I'm suggesting here is wind throw often occurs in trees that you would assess as being perfectly healthy and reasonable from an above ground inspection. If you just looked at the canopy, you'd say that tree is doing fine, and that it's not a good criterion on which to base any judgments about wind throw, and we'll come back to that. A couple of other things about wind throw that I wanted to talk about. If you're interested in this topic, and some of you, and many of you, if not all of you, have heard Ken James talk about this, my suspicion is that very few of you have actually read Ken's thesis. And as one of his co-supervisors, I have read Ken's thesis, and some of it's very, very difficult to come to terms with, let me tell you. When you've got a whole lot of calculations, a whole lot of models, and that engineering modelling that's taking place. But let me say this to you. There is a huge amount information out there based on forestry information. They've done wonderful calculations because the forest trees are worth a lot of money, and so a lot of money is lost when a storm goes through and throws a whole lot of trees. So the foresters have really got serious about this, and they've done some really good research, got some really good numbers. And so, for example, they talk about the slenderness ratio of the tree, which is the tree height in metres divided by the trunk diameter in metres at DBH. And they say 75 or above is sort of behaving like a pole. And in forest trees, a slenderness ratio above 100, they consider that to be unstable. Below 80, it is stable, and of course there's that bit in between where it may or may not be stable. You have to make a judgment. In urban trees, they tend to, and because forest trees tend to grow up with a big trunk and a little bit of foliage at the top, they behave much more like the sail on a mast. Okay, so all of the information that we've so far used has come from forestry. Now in urban trees, completely different model. What happens? Trees not quite so tall, much more spreading. You've got a much bigger canopy area. You've got a thicker trunk as a rule. And in urban trees, a slenderness ratio above 50 has been described as unstable by Defect. And there is some data to support that, but I have to tell you, not a lot of data actually, and relatively few bits of information, but it gives you something to work with. So if you're out assessing, use the slenderness ratio. Not hard ratio to work out. And if the numbers come well below 50, you go, well, that's a good sign. If the numbers for an urban tree are way above 50, and some of you will have these, particularly old conifers growing down on coast or in coastal parks where the trunk has lost all its foliage, a little tuft of vegetation up on top, okay? Have a look at the slenderness ratio. And if they're high, what they say is, have a good look at this one. Have a look at this one in a bit more detail. And I'll tell you how to do that before we finish. Now, the other thing about a lot of this early work is that the foresters used what they call static calculations. In other words, they saw everything as rigid. The mast was rigid, the sail area was determined. Now, these didn't take into account any of the dynamic responses of the vegetation or any of the dynamic forces that are involved. And this is where Ken James has really done a great deal of work. Now, a couple of other things to be said. In general, when you talk about wind throw, size is a significant issue to consider. But it may not be the way you think that size is important. For example, if you ask the ordinary citizen, they would tell you big tree is more likely to fall over than a smaller one. Why? Because it's bigger. Why? Because it's got a bigger sail area. They're going back to that old-fashioned model. But the truth of the matter is that a big tree, much greater forces involved, but because it's bigger, it has a greater mass. And that mass is going more or less straight down. Secondly, they develop much greater self-loading and much better anchorage. They are exposed to higher winds and therefore greater forces, and they can have greater bending moments. But because they're older, they've adapted or acclimatised to the direction of the winds. Okay? So very often, what you'll find in a real storm event, the big old trees, the ones that everyone was worried about, stand, and it's the small ones that get literally ripped out of the ground. So size does matter, and you have to consider that in your sort of thinking. Now, we've talked about static and dynamic forces. The analysis of static forces has been influencing arboriculture now for over 20 years. The work of Defect is a classic. Defect looked at trees as if they were static organisms, static structures. What that meant was you had relatively simple calculations. You looked at levers, you looked at moments, you looked at angles, those sorts of things. But what he didn't do, and what most people haven't done in these past calculations, is to look at the tree's characteristics, to look at the capacity for the tree to change during a storm event. And that's where dynamic loads come in. And dynamic forces and dynamic loads are really simple. they're simply the forces that change during a particular event. So, to give you an example, when the wind blows on say a glass structure, the glass doesn't move and shake and develop holes and all that sort of stuff because it's rigid. But what the tree canopy does, the leaves don't hang there in the wind, they change and they alter and they reduce the drag. That would be a dynamic force. And they can actually cause eddies in the wind, so that when the force hits the tree, the eddies may cause the foliage, instead of moving outwards like a rope or a strand, the leaves might move upwards and direct the wind upwards and away from the canopy behind. So in other words, the forces change during the storm event, and that's what dynamic forces sort of means. Now, the most important part of this dynamic sort of response of trees, I've mentioned to some of you in the past, is mass damping. And this is what I think Ken James's greatest contribution has been to our understanding of tree canopies and how they work. And that is that trees are mass damping. Their structure is a mass damping structure. And what mass damping is it's a system where when a force hits a tree and the tree starts to move, it sets up a harmonic wave that moves down the trunk. When it hits the ground, the wave comes back up. When it comes back up to the top, it hits the top of the tree and it comes back down. Now, without a mass damping, if you have a single pole, that structure behaves like a ruler that you hold on the edge of the bench and give a flip. And you know how it sort of vibrates? Okay? But with all of the branches and foliage, when you're in a tree, the force hits the tree, it responds, and very often there's no further harmonic wave moving down the trunk. Okay? In other words, it flattens or dampens the force. Now, you all know this. You may never have put it into words, but anyone that's worked up a tree in a rope and harness knows that if you've got no branches on your tree, she's moving and flapping around, and occasionally there's been situations where the harmonic wave has moved down, bounce back up because there's no branches, come back down, weakness in the tree, all of the waves happen to meet at that point of weakness and the tree just snaps. Okay, and you know the classic case where climber attached to the top gets pulled out of the tree to his death because of that branching, that harmonic sort of movement. If you've got branches and foliage, that dampens the effect of that force. And the tree, branches and foliage behave just like a mass damper does in a building that's earthquake sort of prone. What they do in those buildings is they put a railway track full of rocks so that when the wave moves, the truck moves one way, it moves the other, but you don't get multiple harmonic waves. And the tallest building in the world, I think, has a mass damper, which is a pendulum. And everyone thinks that pendulum is there as part of the sort of indoor decoration. Whoa, look at that, that's the world's biggest pendulum. But it's actually there to stop any movement of the building if an earthquake occurs. And that's what foliage and leaves do. Now, what this does, of course, is raises lots and lots of questions. So, for example, if you've got a big tree, sure you've got big forces, but you've also got massive mass damping capacity. Absolutely massive mass damping capacity. And in other contexts, you could ask yourself, what does sort of crown reduction or weight reduction do? Doesn't do anything, but that's not for today. We'll get on to that one another day. Now, just a couple of other things. I'm going to just skip forward to the classic diagrams, because I know you all know this. What you've got to remember is that the classic sort of Watson and Neely root system is a very wide, shallow, spreading root plate, isn't it? We all know that now, it's commonly accepted, but don't forget there are lots of descending roots that come off that root plate. Now, those descending roots tend to concentrate around the trunk of the tree. You all know that for the most part they're not tap roots, they're descending roots. The ordinary citizen doesn't, okay? And I've got to tell you, some American arborists don't either. I was quite staggered about the lack of knowledge of root systems in some of the folks at the conference in the States. Now, these descending roots are really, really important because they anchor the root plate in terms of wind throw. There are a few variables. We don't know whether every species develops lateral descending roots. We think they do, but they don't always develop them to the same extent. They don't always have them in the same distribution. Okay, so there is some species variation. There are some species, as you well know, that retain taproots. That's fine. A taproot is normally lost, but not always if the opportunity presents itself. And in some soils, descending root development may not be as prolific and as well developed as we would normally expect. Now, the way the descending roots tend to work is that closer to the trunk, they tend to grow deeper and they tend to be bigger in diameter. How big are the descending roots under the trunk? Somewhere between 100 to 150 mils is pretty typical. How many would you have? 6, 8, 10? Something of that sort. Now, when you go out from the trunk, what the descending roots tend to do is they tend not to go straight down, they tend to go out at angles and they tend to taper. Okay, so the descending roots further out from the trunk have characteristics that are somewhat different from the descending roots close to the trunk. Take-home message for folks in this room is that you've got to look after your descending roots. You want to make sure that your tree has got good, healthy descending roots. And what does that mean? In general, it means that your water table isn't too high, you haven't got compaction, and you're not waterlogging soils. That's generally what it means. A lot of us have really focused on the root plate system, and rightly so. I mean, there's been a revolution in the way we think about tree roots since the first landscape below ground in the early 90s, so 20 years on. We really have sort of focused on the root plate. And in all of those sort of models of root systems, the descending roots are always mentioned, but they're not always given the attention in terms of tree stability that they should be. And so I'm correcting that today. Structural roots are really important because they're heavy and there's lots of them. And sort of under the tree protection on development sites legislations, these sort of structural roots tend to be protected. Fine roots in large numbers are really important in tree anchorage, so you want them all over the place. Why? Because they have a big surface area in contact with the soil and it increases the mass of that root system, root-soil interaction. Just as a matter of interest, when you look at anchorage, about 75% of the resistance to being thrown over is from descending roots. They contribute to about 75%, and the leeward roots contribute about 25%. Now, what happens in a wind throw event? During a wind throw event, the leeward lateral roots bend and eventually break, often close to the base near the trunk of the tree. You saw that in the diagram I started with. The windward roots are often pulled from the soil, and if there are descending roots present, they'll come out as well. If there are no descending roots, then those windward roots will come out so easily, there'll virtually be no damage. Okay, they'll just come out as a whole. And then, if there's a taproot, but more commonly, one of the larger descending roots close to the trunk, the tree will rotate around one of those roots. So the tree will sort of turn as it falls. Now that's the pattern that you normally get in wind throw. Now a couple of other things to note here. Size matters, as I've mentioned. Big trees, big roots, bigger root mass, all that sort of stuff. And the other thing that you need to know, I think, is that the pattern of root development is quite responsive to the wind. So what you tend to find is that you've got about 60% of the roots on the windward side of the tree and 40% of the roots on the leeward side or the protected side of the tree. So the model that I'm now using of a root system is that you've got this ellipse in the direction of the wind, and 60% of the roots will be on the windward side, 40% on the leeward side, and you can see the canopy there. I've dotted that as a sort of typical, more or less circle, although it's slightly distorted on the computer here. Now, I think this is really important. So here's a couple of take-home messages for you. And I'm talking to landscape students as well, as part of one of the courses at Burley, and I put this diagram up and I said, now look, if you're going to plant in a windy spot, don't stick the tree in the middle of the planting space. Give it 60% on the windward side and 40% on the leeward side. Don't you think that's logical? I mean, it seems reasonable to me. There's a lot of evidence for this. Secondly, if you guys are out there in the real world, the moral of the story is don't label cut-through roots on the windward side. Okay? Don't leave the windward side roots alone. I mean, you and I, all of us, want to leave all of the roots alone. Okay? But if you see some bozo who comes along with a backhoe and decides to cut through your root system and goes through the windward side, you go, oh, we've got a problem. Okay? Because if they've cut close to the canopy line, they may have taken out, half of that windward side root system. If they've done it on the leeward side, you might get away with it. You might actually get away with it. So there are really practical implications to this. So if you're assessing a tree, okay, you're looking at size, you're looking at the slenderness ratio, now you're looking at the direction of the prevailing wind and asking yourself, where was the damage done? Okay, so it can help you make a judgment about what might happen in the future. Three basic forms of root failure for windthrow. The first one is a straight root is pulled directly from the soil, and what happens is you get a sudden failure as frictional forces between the soil and the straight root are exceeded. And that's when you get these classic, God, who would have thought it? Look, she just fell over. No warning. The second one, a lateral root with many small lateral roots is pulled, and as it's pulled, some break, and then it holds, then some more break, and some more break, and you can actually see the tree, it sort of comes down and then eventually fails, but you see it going in steps. And then the third one is where failure occurs in abrupt steps as the major root components break one after the other, and that's when you see the tree clunk, then clunk, then clunk, and down she comes. So there are three common patterns. And of course there is an issue with rainfall. If you've had lots of rain, then it reduces the soil strength. So for those of you that have done some soil science, you know that drier soils have a stronger strength, and as soon as you wet them, they virtually become almost like lubricated plasticine, and you can just pull the root out. So a significant contribution to windthrow is if you've got lots and lots of rain and then strong winds, the combination of the two. The factors that sort of affect tree stability, I've listed here. The soil must be resistant to fracture and remain drier than its plastic limit. That's what you want to happen. Doesn't always happen. You want your longest 2 or 3 windward roots to be strong and to resist pulling, and of course to resist the snapping and shear. You want a significant tree mass that's sort of keeping the tree anchored in the ground, because gravity still is a significant sort of force holding the tree in place. You want leeward roots that are resistant to buckling or hinging in compression, and you want them to resist snapping in shear. And then you want a good root plate and a good set of descending roots. Okay, now I'm going to just move on. I'm not quite sure how much more time I've got, but I want to talk about some data that I presented, and this is all based on trees that have fallen over in Melbourne. Some of these trees fell over well over 20 years ago, and others fell over during a major storm event in 2005, which some of you may remember. I've subsequently got another about 20 or 30 trees that I've looked at, so it's up around 110 now, but I'm not going to publish anything on those 30 new trees because the story is exactly the same as the one I've already published. Okay, so all it does is confirm what we already know. And what the study involved was looking at trees that fell over and looking at things that correlated with that failure. And these are the 7 things that I'd like you to consider. Evidence of site trenching within 4 metres of the trunk, significant damage or decay to the lateral roots, evidence or loss of descending roots, evidence of soil compaction, presence of fill around the base, waterlogging around the base of the tree, canopy dieback and dead wood. They're the 7 correlates. Now I'm not saying, and I want to make this really clear, that any of these cause wind throw. I can't say that. This study is not about cause and effect. It's about correlation. Tree fell over, here were a number of things that we found associated which might be involved in the failure, but I can't prove that they are. Now, what does the data tell us? What it tells us is shown here in this table, and I've modified this table somewhat recently, and I think it makes it a bit easier to read. When you look at these 80 trees, 58, 59% of them, near enough, had trenching works through their root system. Okay, about 60%. Lateral root damage was present on nearly 90%. Descending root damage was on nearly 90%. Compaction 65%. Fill around the base on over half the trees that fell. Waterlogging on over half the trees. And only a third of the trees showed any symptoms of sort of poor canopy structure or dieback. Now, what does this information tell us? First one is, it suggests that for trees that fall, it's not just the natural events, not just the storm that sort of contributes to their failure. It's what we've done in the past, how we've managed them. So, trenching through the root system. How do you find out whether there's been trenching through the root system? Well, what I've discovered is you ask someone, and when you ask someone, they'll tell you, no, never trench through the root system. Okay? Because their memory only goes back 2 years. And if it hasn't happened in the last 2 years or 3 years, well, what relevance could it be to the world that we live in? Okay, 10 years ago, well, that's past history. Well, you know that's not the true case with trees. And the other thing I found is, if you're going to find out whether there's trenching, you scrape away the mulch. I reckon mulch is wonderful stuff. You've all heard me speak on the wonderful benefits of mixed particle size organic mulch in the past, and I really love it. But I also think it's a bit like the carpet that you sweep all the sort of dirt under when you wash the floor. If some bozo's gone through and really made a wreck of a root system, you put a lovely bit of mulch over the top, and it's like you've never done anything. Okay? So I can remember 3 cases in the last couple of years where I've gone to have a look at trees and asked, was there any trenching through the root system? And the answer was, no, we've never done anything like that. And when I got the rake out of the car, you can see them blanch. What's he going to do with the rake? And you scrape off the mulch on the windward side, you can see the trench running straight through the root system, 2 metres out from the trunk of the tree. Okay, so scrape away the mulch. Lateral root damage is normally from mowers, and it's often associated with turf, but it can be from pedestrian traffic, it can be from a whole vehicle traffic, tyres, all that sort of stuff. And then I was asked in America, how the hell can you make up your mind about descending roots? Well, you can't. The only way you can tell whether the descending roots are there or not is when the tree has fallen over. You can't find out anything about them before it falls. But what you can do is you can use your knowledge and experience as an arborist to say, this is a really compacted site. This site, these soils are waterlogging, so the odds are the descending roots are going to be shallow. You can do that, okay? And you can take that into account when you're looking at your assessments. Now what happens is, the pattern of water movement around a lot of urban trees is changed by the things that we do to them. A classic example, you build a footpath or a road, you're probably going to get a bank up of water behind the concrete and the fill that you put in. So very often our works create waterlogged soils and change water flow patterns. In Faulkner Park, for example, I couldn't figure out why there was 30 centimetres of fill around the tree I photographed. Another tree had 50 centimetres of fill around it. I just couldn't. Why would you be filling around a tree in a park? So I rang Ian Shears at the Melbourne City Council and said, look, I've been having a look at these trees down at Faulkner Park. How come they've got fill around them? And he said, oh, I'll have a look at the records. And about 3 days later, he rang me back and he said, you know, the pathways in Faulkner Park have been replaced 6 times in the last century. 6 times in the last century. That's once every 15 to 20 years. And what happens is the roots come up, the roots cause a bit of movement in the bitumen, so what do? They lift up the old bitumen, they put some fill around, level things off, and they put a new footpath in. Then they do it again, and again, and again, and again, and they might only be putting down 400-500 millimetres each time, but you do that 6 times, and you're up around 30 centimetres, a few places a bit more uneven, it's even higher. So it's quite remarkable how these things can contribute. And of course, as soon as you put fill, you're altering the movement of the soil moisture. In 2005, I stood in Falkland Park with Peter May as we looked at the damage. And I said to Pete, what do you notice? And Pete's very observant. The first thing he said was, there are no eucalypts. And there weren't any. A couple of eucalypts had lost branches, but there weren't any eucalypts growing near the paths. Every one of the trees that fell in Falkland Park was near a footpath. Every single one of them. Okay. When we looked under the trees, you could see water still in the holes 2 days later. So they'd all been waterlogged, they'd all been compacted, they'd all had fill around. We went up to another tree, and it was a lovely sunny day after the storm, because this storm happened in February. And we're looking at this tree, and I said to Pete, do you reckon the root plate of that tree is moving? And we could see it sort of just rocking gently in the breeze. Okay, it hadn't fallen over in the storm, but it was definitely going to go. And we gave Ian a ring and said, listen, one of your trees is actually moving in the ground down at Falkland Park, you better get to it. So it went as well. And these are the sort of patterns that you get. Over and over again, when I was shown wind-thrown trees in urban areas, they were close to footpaths, they were close to roads, they had infrastructure built through them, they'd been tunnelled through, they were waterlogged, they were compacted. Over and over and over again. Now, I'm not saying that all urban trees fall over because of things that we've done to the root system. I'm not suggesting that for a minute, but I am suggesting that we contribute to it. And as a consequence, we've got to think about it. Now, from a practical point of view, here are some things that I want you guys as arborists to include in your assessment procedures. Firstly, check out any damage or decay to the lateral root systems, particularly on the windward side. Particularly on the windward side. You may get away with some damage on the leeward side, you may not, but if you've got damage close to the trunk on the windward side, you're really asking for trouble. Try and make a judgment about descending roots. Is this tree growing in a great place where descending roots are likely to be okay, or has it been paved over, filled over, cut through, and are descending roots likely to be affected? Any evidence of trenching works, and as I said, a rake under mulch, great benefit. What about compaction? Compaction, you all know it can cause problems, and one of the problems it causes is the loss of descending roots simply because there's no oxygen getting to those depths. Waterlogging is a significant issue, and then of course look for fill. Trees that don't have natural flare and have been filled around are more likely to fail. It's not proof that they'll fail, it's just more likely. And then also look at the canopy, but remember, it was the least important of all of those 7 criteria that we looked at. Now what this means is those points now can become part of your assessment process. When you're looking at a tree, if someone says to you, what is the danger of that tree falling over? You've got a few things to look for. And I'm going to tell you what to do with this in a minute or two's time. Now, the other thing that people have said to me, well, are you saying that it's only urban trees that get wind thrown? And of course I'm not saying that, because I've been very interested in wind thrown forest trees, but I don't have much data. Here are 15 trees that I've looked at, and I'm just comparing the same 7 criteria, forest trees and urban trees. And the first one is the loss of sinker roots after they fall. When the forest trees fall over, I haven't found one yet that's got any descending roots. They have a very shallow lens of roots, no descending roots, they're all gone. For the most part, you do find that they've got some decay in their lateral roots. Of course, they're not compacted because they're growing in the forest, so I haven't found anywhere there's soil compaction. Waterlogging has been a component in nearly 2/3 of those, and very often in the forest, why would you get waterlogging all of a sudden? and it's usually got to do with something that's happened maybe 300 or 400, 500 metres away, roadworks, change of drainage, something of that sort, okay, which normally causes the problem. No site trenching or the presence of fill, and of course in the forest trees very often the canopies are looking a bit ordinary, a bit thin. So in conclusion, what I wanted to sort of highlight with you is I think management practices have a profound impact on wind-thrown trees. What I'm urging you to do is to take these various criteria into your consideration when you're looking at the possibility of wind throw, and be mindful of the fact that looking at the canopy of the tree is a very poor indicator of what might happen with wind throw. You might say, well, the fact that in the forest or even urban trees a third of the canopies looked a bit ordinary is significant. Well, it is significant, but it's not as big a number as 2/3 not showing any symptoms, so you can be tricked into a sense of false security. The other thing that I wanted to point out to you is that you've got to understand that it's the roots on the windward side that are particularly important, and you won't get away with sort of dodgy practices and management practices on the windward side. Now, in concluding, what I also wanted to say to you is this. What happens if you go through, you see a tree and you tick 7 boxes? Every single criteria says, does that mean the tree should be pulled out? No. What it means is you go to the next level. You really start to look at the tree's stability. You might use some of the equipment that Ken James talks about to see if the tree is moving in the ground. What ticking all of the boxes would suggest is this is a tree that requires further investigation and further management. And if you don't do it and then something happens, that's when you're open to legal liability. That's when you're really open to liability. So in this talk, what I've been trying to tell you is, 1, don't forget the slenderness ratio. It's a useful tool because what does it do? It gives you a heads up. Okay? Slenderness ratio greater than 50, Mathic said that could be a problem, heads up. Then you've got the 7 criteria. Then you've got the windward root system, 60% or more. And finally, you've got a suggestion that if you tick a whole lot of those criteria, it doesn't mean the tree is going to fall over, it doesn't mean that it's dangerous. What it does mean is you'll go one step further and you'll check the stability of the tree in the ground. There are several ways of doing that, okay, that you've heard about in the past. Follow up. I'll leave it there, I think my time is up.
On the contrary, we've got a fair bit of time for the next speaker, and I'm just you can answer that. And questions? I'm sure we have a few. Mr. Burke, you can go first.
Yeah, Greg, that was pretty interesting. One thing I didn't notice is what you spoke about was the method of planting trees. The trees we saw that failed were usually senescent or mature trees. I didn't see any semi-mature trees that had girdle roots or...
Yep.
That was one thing you didn't mention. I wonder if you could just touch on that point.
Okay. I didn't mention this in the talk, but I have done some work on this in the paper. None of the trees were senescent, and prior to the failure, none of them had been considered at risk of wind throw. I didn't find any that had poor root systems from a propagation point of view. Now, the reason for that, I suspect, is that in this particular study, I wanted to look at big trees that fell over. I wasn't looking for defective root systems. I have done that in other studies, as you well know, and with young trees, they can with those sorts of girdling and kink roots, they can very easily sort of come out in a storm. But the consequences of that are usually not so profound because they're smaller. So yeah, it's a valid point. And the other thing to remember is that in urban trees, and I have put this in the paper, every so often when you publish something in the States, you get up the nose of the Americans, even if you don't actually intend to do so. And some of you, many of you that have been in my classes have heard me describe taproots in trees as juvenile characteristics, And the Americans didn't like that concept at all. So we had a bit of a battle over whether they'd allow me to call taproots juvenile characteristics. But I think they are. Naturally, in many species they are. You know, Mount Nash, they're only there for 30, 40 years. In Eucalyptus lamanii, the bushy eight, the taproot's only there for about 6 years in our soils. So I think they are a genuine juvenile characteristic. But in many urban trees, our propagation techniques make sure that there are no taproots right from the start. You've got a lateral root system, but they do develop the normal descending root pattern as a rule. Okay? If the soils are anyway near half decent, they will develop a normal root plate and descending roots.
One question on wind direction, generalisation in Melbourne. What would you consider the stronger wind directions?
Yeah, okay. Not surprisingly, this question I've been asked both here in Australia, and I was asked the same question, not about Melbourne, in the States. And the question that I was asked is, in the model that I put up, you've got a prevailing wind coming, obviously in my mind from the west, okay, coming from the west, and the root goes out. Now what happens if a tree is growing in a situation where it gets westerly winds at certain times of the year and northerly winds at other times of the year? What will its root system do? And what it will do is it'll develop according to the vector of the two forces. So if you've got, as it were, prevailing north and prevailing west, the windward roots will go out into the northwest. Okay, so they tend to grow that way. You won't get a sort of wing, but you will get a plate moving out at the vector between the two. So yes, that's a really good question. And one of the interesting things as a consequence of this is Melbourne typically has strong northerlies at certain times of the year and strong westerlies at other times of the year. I think most of us would agree with that. That's the way our pattern works. But you know, under climate change models, we're going to have increasingly strong bursts of wind from the east. Now that happened on Black Saturday, and it caught a lot of people off guard when they were expecting the fire to come from the north or the west. One of my former colleagues, for example, had a really great fire plan in place. All the metal heads on the north and the west, all the plastic on the east. Fire came up from the east, everything gone. No fire protection whatsoever. So what you're going to find, I think, is, and what you might need to just keep on your toes about, is during those easterly storms, we are going to see some big trees come down because they don't have the usual or the same sort of root system that's developed for those easterly winds. And this might be something that you don't want to know about, okay, because it is going to make life difficult. Some big trees are going to come down, and some of you are going to inspect a tree and you're going to say it looks pretty good, and then sometime later it's going to come down because of a burst from the east. So that's going to make it quite complicated. I am worried about that, to be honest. Thanks.
Hi Greg. I've written my question down.
Good.
It's in two parts.
Yep.
And it sort of harks back to another question I asked earlier, and it may not be something you want to touch on, but perhaps if you could comment. If we reduce mass damping by significant crown reduction to reduce risk, are we actually increasing risk by disturbing the harmonic waves? And secondly, is crown reduction, crown thinning a possible correlate to significant wind-thrown trees?
Okay. The answer to that question, to put it honestly, is I don't know. Nobody knows the answer to that. That's the million-dollar question. The hypothesis that I would put is that crown reduction, in terms of wind throw, there is no evidence to suggest that crown reduction is efficacious in reducing the risk of wind throw. So in answer to your question, what you're really asking me is, if you take the mass damping component of the canopy and you prune, are you actually making things better or are you making things worse? Because that's the gist of your question. And the answer is nobody has done the work. there is no data either way. Back, I think, about 2000, I went and had a look at this in terms of crown thinning and crown reduction. I went to see if there was any data that suggested they actually worked. And at that time, I couldn't find anything. I went through, I'm not saying there isn't anything, I just couldn't find it. I went through a lot of the literature. And I've made a comment a couple of times along the same lines as your question. So in the States, I did talk to a couple of reasonably significant arborists, people like Jim Smiley, for example, Tom Smiley and Gary Watson about this particular question. And I simply said to them, look, if you accept the mass damping side of things, then you could be making things worse when you crown reduce or you load reduce, depending on what you want to call it. And they're not convinced you are, because it's big business in the States, particularly because of ice loads. So reducing canopies is really big sort of monetary business. But I asked them whether they had any data that showed that it was efficacious in actually reducing the risk of a branch falling, and there's no data. So I'm afraid I can't answer it. If you want my own sort of spin on it, I'm not a big fan of weight reduction or load reduction or canopy reduction. I'm not a big fan of canopy thinning. Now, because of my sort of horticultural background, I accept thinning harms trees but might be good for other reasons in a garden. Okay? So if I'm talking to a group of home gardeners on something like this, and I will be on Wednesday night, for example, and a home gardener says, look, I want to have a garden under one of my trees. Can I thin the canopy so the light gets through? And I say to them, well, I prefer you didn't. And they say, well, I'll remove the tree. Then I'll say, well, I prefer you did. Thin the canopy. So you can see where I'm in. I'm in a bind in that one from an arboricultural versus horticultural point of view. And with weight reduction of branches, I've given my reluctant sort of support to that, because arborists from time to time have to demonstrate that they've done something as part of a risk mitigation process. But I've also written that I'm not convinced it actually does anything in actually reducing the risk.
Is there any chance that you can... You're a great advocate for this sort of industry forum, and you obviously speak everywhere all the time.
Yep.
So can you push some buttons and get some research happening with some of the people that you know and are connected to?
Look, I'd love to, and there are a couple of people in this room that I can recall doing very fine undergraduate degrees at Burnley that I'd welcome back as part-time masters or PhD students at the drop of a hat. Because it's going to be someone from the industry that has to do it, because you're the only people that are out there pruning enough to actually get some data. So it would be a wonderful project for someone that wanted to do a part-time masters, say over 4 years, or a part-time PhD over 6 years. You can collect the data as part of your business operation. There's nothing to stop you then analysing that data. And the longer you've got, the more trees you've got to work on, and the more likely you are to have some really meaningful information. So yes, anyone here wants to take up that offer, see me at the end of the talk. I've got some steak knives as well.
Mark Hartley, in his tree anatomy course, he points out the importance of compression roots in the compressors versus tension roots in the eucalypt.
Yep.
Do you find any correlation in the wind throw to leeward versus windward roots on compressors versus eucalyptus?
Haven't done that work. I suggest that you have a look at the paper by Kim Coda. If you look up something along the lines of Kim Coda tree anchorage or something of that, or tree roots and anchorage, have a look at his paper. In general, the model that I've put up isn't just for woody angiosperms. It should apply, the model should apply to both. And as far as I'm aware, if you have a look at Kim's paper, he talks a lot about the same things or similar things that I've presented, but applying to conifers. So I think in the main they behave very similarly. I haven't picked up a difference between them. Okay, but I'm pointing out here that I haven't actually done an analysis. What you need to do is look at 80 conifers and do a stats. It hasn't happened. Simply because I haven't seen enough conifers falling to be able to go into that data.
Just quickly, mulch. Are you likely to do any waterlogging damage? I'm pro-mulch, but it's something that I've always raised for myself. If you put mulch on at the wrong time of year, you're reducing your ability for the grass to take a certain amount of that moisture. Any theories?
Yes. Look, I've told this anecdote once before. When the landscape below ground third volume was being contemplated, I was sharing an office with Peter May, and I said to Peter, "You really should be presenting at this conference." And he said, "Oh, no, I've missed the deadline." And I sort of said to him, "Hang on, you know the editor, send him an email." And I said, "If you don't, I will." And Pete sent him an email, and Gary Watson said, "Yeah, come over and have a chat." Now, during that conference, the third landscape below ground, they got 30 of the soil scientists into the same room, and they had a simple question. They were asked, what was the single most important thing they learned about tree roots in the previous decade? And the unanimous answer was the benefits of mulch. From all of them, the benefits of mulch. Now, during the most recent ISA, there were a couple of queries raised about whether mulch was as good as we think it was. Okay? There were 2 papers in the proceedings last week, and you'll be able to see these. One I think is being published in the next Arborist, the Journal of Art, and so have a look at them. But in general, the answer is that mulch is wonderful. Okay? Now, there are a couple of caveats. First was, not all soils respond exactly the same way to mulch. Okay, you'd expect that. There's better and greater benefits in some soils than others. The other interesting thing was that one of the speakers was very keen to point out that the coarser the mulch for trees, the better the responses. So in other words, don't use fine particle mulch. Okay, because you can run into problems with that. So I was quite relieved to hear of that paper because Jeff Conlon and Peter and I we have a meeting about every 6 months, and I say to Jeff, what am I supposed to know about irrigation? Is it still the drippers or leaky pipe under mulch? Is that the way we behave? And he tells me it is. I asked Pete, any new developments on mulch? And the 3 of us have been advocating a mixed particle size mulch over a long period of time. We want that coarse component in it. That worked really well. The other question that was raised was, are all mulches the same? And the answer is no. There are people that use hard mulches, stones and pebbles. They're perfectly good mulches, but they don't give you any of the soil benefits. Another situation was, are any of the dyed mulches harmful to trees? And the answer to that question is, so far as we know, the dyes are all non-phytotoxic. Okay, and you may be wondering why they use the dyes. For example, there's a big industry in the States that takes damaged pallets and basically dices them, colours them, and then flogs them off as fashion mulch. Okay, and there's a market for it, and they recycle the pallets. So that question was raised. And there was one other question, but it's gone out of my head. Oh yes. Interestingly enough, there are several studies based on long-term studies of weed control, waterlogging and nutrition. And by long-term I mean the best part of 10 years. I think one of them was for 9 years. And the results of that study were, they put the mulch down in 2000. They were intending to follow its performance for 2 years and did. And all of the outcomes were beneficial. Aeration, water level, tree growth, girth, height, everything was positive. Guy went away, ended the project, came back in 2009 and saw that the plots were still there, dashed out to see what sort of data he could get after 9 years, and after 9 years, weeds were still well under control, okay, which was pretty spectacular. The trees had a bigger girth, they had greater height, the soil had much better organic matter, much better aeration, much better water retention, and I've left one out. Oh, and better nutritional properties. So in answer to your question, mulch is good.
Yeah, Greg, I noticed there was no Araucaria in that.
No.
Have you ever seen any fail from Winthrop?
No. You know,
Nor have I.
no, figured you might. It's interesting. You know we did that Araucaria study, don't you? Maybe you don't. Have I got time, Shane?
Just quickly, because I want to hear this, because I got a report the other day that said Araucaria is a suicide tree because of their poor root system.
With the Araucarias, and we published this, just got to think of the guy's name, it'll come to me in a minute. Kia, who's on the register of trees? Lockie Andrews is the lead author on this paper. Now we looked at several hundred southern conifers, not just Araucaria, agathis, podocarpus, because as you know, Lockie Andrews is a southern conifer fanatic, absolute fanatic, makes the orchid guys look tame. And we looked at all these trees, and we gave them an arboricultural rating. In other words, how likely were they to shed, how much damage did they do, what did their roots do to hard landscapes, how common were co-dominant stems. We looked at trees that were on average a century old. In the Araucarias, they ranged from about 24 to 26 or 27 metres in height. And by and large, you would describe our results as suggesting they were the ideal urban tree. Now, you may all be going, oh, hang on, how could that be? And the answer is really simple. Back in the 1800s, they knew these were going to be bloody great big trees, so they didn't do stupid things with them. They tended to put them in big garden beds, they tended to give them space, and if you left their root systems alone, and you left their canopies alone, they tended to be just really wonderful urban trees. They caused very, very little damage. Now, subsequent to that report, I have seen one tree that has a co-dominant stem. Okay, it was a bloody crummy tree anyway, but where it was planted probably contributed to that. And I've seen one subsequent to that paper that caused some pavement lifting. But other than that, they are really good trees, and they are not prone to wind throw. Thanks, Shane.
Okay, Mr. Okay, no further questions? Okay, thank you very much.